morning. How are you? Yeah. If I haven't met you yet, apparently I'm the right Reverend Michael Bailey, according to Brandon. So that's nice. That's really nice. It's a pleasure to be with you guys this morning as we get into our Advent series together. Um, did you hear that? If you listen very carefully, I think you can just make out the sound of Michael Bublé cashing all of those royalty checks. Uh, that can only mean one thing. It's Christmas time. It's Christmas time. That's where we're at. And I've told you guys before, this is my absolute favorite time of year. This is my favorite season out of the year. I love everything about it. I love the music. I love the food. I love the movies. I love all of it. But honestly, it is one of my favorite seasons in part, if not predominantly, because it is such a unique and special season for us as the church. It's such a special season for God's people. It's a season that, as you know by now, we call Advent, which is just a word that comes from the Latin adventus, and all it means is arrival, okay? Advent is the special season for believers when the church from all over the world takes the weeks leading up to Christmas to reflect on the significance of Jesus' first arrival some 2,000 plus years ago, to look forward to his second. And for us, what it really affords us the opportunity to do is just slow down a bit, to kind of hit the pause button on all the other things going on out there in life and all the other stuff, excuse me, that accompanies the holidays. Not that any of that stuff is bad or anything like that, but to hit the pause button on all of that, to slow down a bit and to prepare room, so to speak, in our hearts and in our minds to reflect on and rejoice in and be comforted by the truth of Jesus. The way we like to say it is like during the season of Advent, we're not necessarily trying to learn a bunch of new things, though hopefully we will learn some new things, but that's not the expressed goal. The goal is to remember the timeless truth of Jesus, who he is, what he's done for us, and how that is a game changer for the rest of our lives together. That's all we're trying to pour our attention to in this season. And that's exactly what we intend to do for the next few weeks. As Brandon said, if you haven't already, be sure to pick up an Advent guide in the lobby. We would love to bless you with that. But today, we're going to start our time in Matthew chapter 1, which is going to be a very common Advent passage about the arrival of Jesus into the world. We're going to start there, but very quickly, we're going to move into Isaiah 7 this morning. So if you want to grab a Bible and turn there and kind of put your fingers in both places, we'll be in Matthew 1 to begin with, and then Isaiah chapter 7 briefly. But let's just kind of get started. In the first chapter of Matthew, we're going to pick up in verse 18. This should sound very familiar to you. This is what it reads. This is how the birth of Jesus the Messiah came about. So this is how God came into the world. His mother Mary was pledged to be married to Joseph, but before they came together, she was found to be pregnant through the Holy Spirit. So before they had done what married people have to do to start a family, Mary was found to be miraculously pregnant. But Joseph is unsure about that story, so to speak. Verse 19, but Joseph, her husband, was faithful to the law and yet did not want to expose her to public disgrace. He had in mind to divorce her quietly, so he wanted to do the respectful thing. He didn't want to drag her name through the mud or cause some sort of stir within the community, so he was going to end the marriage quietly. But after he had considered this, an angel of the Lord appeared to him in a dream and said, Joseph, son of David, do not be afraid to take Mary home as your wife, because what is conceived in her is from the Holy Spirit. She is telling you the truth about this child. Verse 21, she will give birth to a son, and you are to give him the name Jesus, because he will save his people from their sins. That's what Jesus means, by the way. Jesus means the Lord saves. But verses 22 and 23 are where I want to focus our attention. All this took place to fulfill what the Lord had said through the prophet. The virgin will conceive and give birth to a son, and they will call him Emmanuel, which means God with us. Now, if you were in church in the 90s, this probably sends Michael W. Smith straight back into your brain, right? Like some of the absolute best Christmas songs ever made were written about Emmanuel. Emmanuel is a name. Or more accurately, it's a title that is commonly heard this time of year. And sometimes it's spelled with an E instead of an I. But the reason that it shows up so much is because it is a cosmically significant name and title. As we see here, Emmanuel means God with us. And I always like starting the season of Advent talking about Emmanuel because God with us is fundamental to what this season is actually all about. And it is massively important for how we understand who Jesus is and how Jesus relates to each and every one of us. The way that I've said it before is that I actually believe that your whole life hinges on what you make out of this name. And I don't think that's an overstatement at all, okay? Your ability to endure hardship, like when things hit the proverbial fan in your life, when the bank account ain't where it needs to be, when your career or your family are in flux, it all hinges on what you make out of this name. Your ability to handle stress, to have stability and the capacity to navigate the inevitable uncertainties and curveballs of life hinges on this name. And not just to get through it, but to be able to get through it with joy and come out on the other end, something far more beautiful than you were before, hinges on what you make of this name. Your ability to navigate the crushing waves of sin, yours and others, to know what to do with your guilt and your shame and your failure or the pain of what someone else has done to you hinges on this name. Honestly, I think your ability to persevere as a spouse, a friend, and even as a Christian hinges on what you believe about this name, Emmanuel. And maybe that sounds far-fetched to you, but that is precisely the weight that Emmanuel carries. But to help us see that, what we have to do is we have to understand where it comes from, because this is not a title that is given to the Messiah out of nowhere. The thing you have to know when you read the book of Matthew is that Matthew is coming from a very Jewish mindset, all right? And he is writing to a predominantly Jewish audience who is following Jesus now. And so he is saturated in the Old Testament. His work is saturated with Old Testament references. And so when he drops this reference to the prophet in verse 22, he is doing that for a reason. He wants us to go back to the Old Testament to understand why he included the words that he included. And so that's why we have to go back to Isaiah chapter 7. We got to go back to Isaiah chapter 7 to understand what Matthew is talking about in Matthew chapter 1. And so hopefully you kept your finger there, but if not, feel free to turn there and we'll start looking at it. Now, you're going to have to bear with me for just a minute. Because you're going to have to let me set the stage for you a bit, because what's happening here is we're getting thrust into the middle of a story. And on the surface, it's not going to strike you as a quintessential Christmas story, all right? It's a bit like the Die Hard of Christmas passages, okay? And by that, I mean like you don't think it's a Christmas story at first, but afterwards you realize it's a classic, you know? That's Isaiah chapter 7, all right? Isaiah chapter 7 takes place some 700 years before the events in Matthew. And it's not a story about babies in a manger or stars over Bethlehem or anything like that. It's a story of war. It's a story of war and pain and violence. It takes place during a dark time in Jewish history. The once prosperous nation has suffered a civil war and has been split in two. And here we pick up with the southern kingdom called Judah, who is led by a relatively inexperienced king named Ahaz. And at this moment, there were several kingdoms to the north that were threatening the life and peace of Judah. Basically, two other kingdoms were attacking them, trying to force Judah to team up with them against a bigger bully headed their way, the Assyrian Empire, who is just kicking butt and taking names throughout the Middle East. And now, I'm not a military strategist or anything like that, but generally when it comes to war or even just your good old-fashioned street fight, you typically don't want to be surrounded and having to fight guys off from all sides, right? And you usually want to have more firepower than the other guy. But in this situation, Judah has neither. Judah has neither, and Ahaz knows this. He knows he is staring down the barrel of a zero-sum situation. He can refuse to join these other two kingdoms against Assyria, and they can take him out, or he can join with them, and then they can all be taken out together when Assyria comes knocking. And so from his seat on the bus, there's no win here. There's absolutely no win for him or his people. There's no way out. Death and destruction seem like an inevitability. And so he's panicking. And he's thinking, okay, what do I do? What do I do? What's the call here? How do we make it out of this? Should I surrender? Should I try to figure out a different solution? Should I go all Dwight Schrute and see if they want to form an alliance or something like that? Like, what do we got to do here? Or a bigger question, God, where are you? God, where are you in this? Don't you see? Aren't we supposed to be your people? Don't you see what's happening to us? The threat that is in front of us? Why is he letting this happen? You know, I know a few of us have had the pressure of leading a country through the threat of war, but I do think we've all had some sort of similar experience where all that your eyes tell you is that there's no way out of whatever the situation is that you're facing. And you don't know what to do or where to turn. Maybe it's a moment of some sort of financial strain or a diagnosis that you never expected. Perhaps it's the grief of some loss or the weight of your own sin and shame, and it just all feels like too much. And you don't know what to do. You don't know where to go. You don't know where to turn. This is where Ahaz is at. And it's why God sends the prophet Isaiah to him to encourage him in the face of this conflict to trust in God. And this is where we pick up in verse 10. It reads, "Again, the Lord spoke to Ahaz. Ask a sign of the Lord your God. Let it be as deep as Sheol or as high as heaven." He says, ask me for a sign that I will take care of you. That's what's happening here. Ask me for a sign that I will take care of you. Ask me for a sign that I will be a better source of security and protection for you than making deals with nations that don't know me, and I'll prove it to you, Ahaz. I'll prove it to you that I am who I say I am. Which, can we just say, what an incredible offer, right? Like, what an absolutely incredible offer. God says anything you can think of, as outlandish as you can think of it, ask me for it and I will do it. Because I want you to know I got you. I want you to know I got you. I mean, think about your circumstances for a moment, whatever they are. Those deep moments of doubt or fear where you wonder whether or not God will come through. The moments of pain or fear, they just make you go, God, I just want to know that you see me here and that you haven't left me and that I'm going to make it, that you're going to get me through this deal. That's where Ahaz is at, and this is what God's offering. I mean, this is absolutely incredible for God to say, hey, I'll give you a sign and I'll prove it to you. Verse 12, but Ahaz said, I will not ask, and I will not put the Lord to the test. Which initially might strike you as like a real pious or humble response, but it's not, because God told him to do a thing. God told him to ask, but Ahaz hides his disobedience underneath the guise of humility. The issue is that Ahaz is unwilling to trust what he can't see. Trusting God to deliver in this situation just feels so far-fetched to him. His power seems so distant, but Assyria and these other nations' power, well, that just seems really close. In fact, elsewhere in 2 Kings, we find out that this is exactly the case, because what Ahaz winds up doing is cutting a deal with Assyria. He trusts Assyria's power over God's, and it's a decision that will have far-reaching consequences. But that fear and that distrust is what prompts God to respond with the words that Matthew will later include. Verse 13. And he said, hear then, O house of David. Is it too little for you to weary men that you weary my God also? Isaiah's a little sassy, and I kind of like it. Therefore, the Lord himself will give you a sign. Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and shall call his name Emmanuel. Isaiah says, are you kidding me, Ahaz? Have you forgotten who God is? The God who sent the plagues and parted the sea to save you from Egypt. The God who was with your great-great-grandpa, King David, to deliver him and the people from the hand of the Philistines. Have you forgotten? Ahaz, your fear is misplaced. And you might be too afraid to ask God for a sign, but God is going to give you one anyway. He will give you a sign that is actually as outlandish as something as deep as Sheol, the place of the dead, or as high as heaven. He will do a thing that seems impossible to you so that you will know he is who he says he is. And that impossible thing will be that the virgin will give birth to a son. Now, some scholars say that word virgin here should be translated as young woman, which is acceptable in the Hebrew, but the earliest translations make it clear that that is not how the original audience understood it. It's not merely a young woman, but a woman for whom giving birth would be an absolute impossibility. And God would do this outlandish thing to show that he can be trusted, that he is a God who delivers on his promises, that he is a God who rescues his people, that he is a God who can be trusted to save. Despite how things may seem, despite what our eyes may tell us, despite how you may feel, all hope is not lost when God is the one holding the keys. And not only will this child be born outlandishly, but his identity will be outlandish as well. For the child will be God with us, Emmanuel. He will be God God to come and do what you, O Ahaz, are afraid he can't and won't come and do. He will be God who has come to be with you, to save you. And so you see, these are the dots that Matthew wants his audience to connect, that this prophecy is fulfilled in Jesus, that Jesus is the child Isaiah spoke about, that this promise given through Isaiah so many years before was finally being fulfilled in the birth of this baby. Matthew intends for us to see that the coming of Jesus is a proclamation to us, that when it feels like all hope is lost, when it feels like there is no way out, when it feels like the only option is to turn our back to God and choose sin, that God can in fact be trusted. Because Emmanuel is a sign of God's promise that he will get us through. It's who he is. A sign of God's promise that he will get us through. A sign of God's promise to save. His promise to heal. His promise to redeem and make right everything that sin has made wrong, both in us and in our world. And I want you to hear me here. This is what we celebrate at Christmas. And it matters so much for us. You know, I think if we're honest, we'd admit that Christmas tends to have a lot of expectations tied to it, doesn't it? Like, I won't lie, part of the reason that I love it so much is because of the potential of it. It's supposed to be the most wonderful time of the year. This special season where all of our drama sort of gets pushed to the side and everything is as it should be. The family is together. We're happy and joyous. Chestnuts are roasting and we like it for some reason. And all of our problems are miles away, right? And sometimes, sure, it is that. But sometimes it's just not, right? For instance, maybe for you, Christmas is marked by awkward conversations with family members that you don't know and maybe don't even like all that much, if you're honest. Or maybe for you, the holidays simply equate to stress and anxiety, and you wonder, God, how am I supposed to see you in any of this? Maybe it runs even deeper than that. Maybe for you, Christmas isn't all you wish it to be because life isn't all you wished it was either. For some of us, the holidays can be a reminder of what I like to call the midlife malaise, where we get confronted with this reality that life just isn't what we thought it was going to be. The demands are greater. The kids are fussier. It doesn't look how we thought it was going to look. My career isn't fulfilling. My family isn't Hallmark ready. I still struggle in ways that I thought I would be over and done with by now. Maybe for you, this holiday season is accompanied by sadness and pain. Brings up feelings of loneliness in you, that your family isn't what you want, or you don't have the family you wished you had. Maybe this is the year when there's an empty seat at the table that didn't used to be there. A voice missing from all the excitement of opening gifts. The reality for many of us, despite our carefully curated holiday playlists, is that Christmas can be more of a reminder that things haven't gone as you hoped they would, more than anything else. And in all of that, we can find ourselves in a spot very similar to Ahaz, asking, God, where are you? Where are you? What are we to do with this? It all feels off. It feels wrong. It doesn't seem like there's any way out. It seems like the worst is just going to be what it is, and I don't know if I can keep going. You know, I think it's worth noting that Emmanuel didn't come immediately to Ahaz or anyone else. God didn't just 9 months later send this child. There was a significant season for the people of Judah of waiting and longing and pain. As I said before, Ahaz's decision set the stage for a long line of oppression. Assyria, then Babylon, then Persia, and even by the time of Matthew, God's people were living under the boot of a new regime called Rome. It had been some 400 years since the Jewish people had heard even one word from a prophet. I mean, you can imagine what would be easy to think in that space, right? Maybe God doesn't deliver. Maybe he's not who he says he is. Maybe he really has abandoned us. Maybe he won't come through. It makes me think about how my mom would respond when I would miss curfew as a teenager, which totally only happened like a little bit, right? Like it didn't happen a whole lot. I would walk through the door, and every time she would be like, I thought you were lying dead in a ditch somewhere. Like, why didn't you call? You just leave me here to worry, Like her mind would automatically go to the worst case scenario because, like John Gordon is famous for saying, where there's a void in communication, negativity fills that space. And that'd be the case for the Jews here too. Like if there were ever a time for them to wonder, God, where are you? What are you doing? It would be this one. But it's important for us to see that this is the context of the first Advent, because what it tells us is that Advent is for those who are waiting and longing and looking for hope. Because Emmanuel is meant to be hope for our weary souls. Emmanuel is hope for our weary souls. So occasionally, especially when they were younger, my kids would hate to go to bed alone. Some of you who are parents probably know this vibe. Sometimes it would be because they were afraid of the dark, or maybe it was because they were still carrying around some like anxiety, either from the day behind or anxiety for the day ahead. And on those nights, they would look up at me or Lauren, needing that extra little bit of assurance and ask, Mom, Dad, will you stay with me until I go to sleep? And one of my favorite things to do is to get to lay down next to them and say, absolutely, I got you. I'm not going anywhere. And listen, on a bigger level, I can't guarantee that they won't go through tough times, that their lives aren't going to be marked by pain and struggle, that there won't be moments where they experience fear or anxiety. But the one thing I know I can tell them as their dad is that as long as I have breath in my lungs and strength in my body, I'll be with them. That I'm not going anywhere. That I'll be there for them when they need me, and I'll do everything in my power to care for them. And what the Advent is begging us to see is that when God calls Jesus Emmanuel, when God calls himself Emmanuel, that this is who he's telling us he is as well. I love what the German pastor Dietrich Bonhoeffer once said. He said, the celebration of Advent is possible only to those who are troubled in soul, who know themselves to be poor and imperfect, and who look forward to something greater to come. In other words, if you feel burdened and beat down by sin, Advent is for you. If you feel helpless and in need of God to step in and move, Advent is for you. If you feel overwhelmed and imperfect, lost, alone, stuck in shame or guilt, Advent is for you because Advent declares to you that even in that, God is with you, that he offers himself to you in a real and personal way. You see, Emmanuel is more than a spiritual nicety to comfort our souls. It is a declaration for how far God's love for us actually goes. How far God's love is willing to go to save. How far God's love is willing to go to be with his people. How far his love is willing to go to bind up the brokenhearted and set the captive free. Because Emmanuel isn't just God with us in some vague spiritual or metaphorical sense. But the reality of Emmanuel is that he came physically, he physically embodied and overcame, taking on sin and all of its effects, paying the price for sin once and for all, and raising to new life, overcoming our great enemies of sin, death, and the devil forever. And that all of this means that because he is alive, because he is who he says he is, that he came and did what he did, he can be our firm foundation in the midst of every storm. The rock on which our house is built, and it will not fall. That there is no threat too big, no sin too great, no circumstance too painful for his love, his grace, and his power to overcome. Emmanuel reminds us that as long as there is breath in his resurrected lungs, he holds us and he will not let us go. And Advent is meant to draw our attention back to this reality, that this is who our God is. Emmanuel, God with us. And so as we begin the Advent season, this is just where I want to direct our hearts. This is just where I want to direct our hearts and our minds to the hope and the joy that this is who Jesus is. And he can be this for you. He wants to. Whether it's the most wonderful time of the year or the absolute worst, this is the God we worship at Christmas. And Emmanuel is still the promise for us. So wherever you're at this morning, maybe the guilt and shame of your sin is weighing down on you, and you feel too far gone, too messed up, too ruined. What I want you to hear this Christmas is that Jesus is Emmanuel, God with you, who has taken that sin and nailed it to the cross and rose to new life so that you could have new life. To separate your guilt and shame from you as far as the east is from the west. This is who he is and what he's come to do. If you're living in anxiety this season, worried over financial strain or how to get it all done, or worried that everything is just going to fall apart, listen, Jesus is Emmanuel, the Word made flesh, who made the world and holds it in his hands. And if he holds the world, he holds you too. If you're feeling the darkness of depression set in and nothing seems to give you joy, Jesus is Emmanuel, the true light who has come into the world, telling us that the darkness will not last forever. A new day is coming. It's coming. The incarnated and resurrected Son of God has declared it so. Similarly, if you are feeling the loss, whether it be of a relationship or a dream or something in between, and feel the loneliness trying to creep in, Jesus is Emmanuel, the Word made flesh who dwells with you, who has hurt like we hurt, who knows our situation well, who cares and gave his very life to make every sad thing untrue. And because that tomb is empty, we know that is for sure coming. This is the God who arrived in a manger some 2,000 years ago, and the God who will arrive again. Emmanuel, God with us, both now and forever. That's what we celebrate this Christmas. Let's pray.